That night transformed everything in unforeseen ways. The situation commenced with a straightforward request from my stepmother, Olivia, urging me to remain at home while my father left for his customary fishing excursion. At the time seemed mundane. After all, it was merely the two of us most weekends. But I was unaware that this night would evolve into something extraordinary, a night that would challenge the limits of our relationship and make a lasting impression on me. On that particular morning, the house was unusually quiet, and the absence of Dad, who was always around, made the silence seem weird. I had just done my schoolwork and was ready to relax when Olivia called out to me to come into the living room. "You helped me with a matter," and her voice was gentle and almost too casual. I saw she was anxious, but I couldn't figure out why. "Are you sure? What do you require?" I was hesitant to answer her question. Having made my way over to where she was sitting, I inquired about it. Olivia has always maintained a cool demeanor, but tonight I couldn't quite define what it was that was different about the atmosphere. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made my heart race. I tapped the cushion next to her as she asked, unsure of what would follow next, but I couldn't deny that curiosity had started gnawing at me. She repeated, "Quicken, quicken, come sit down." I also patted the cushion next to her. She sat back in her chair, crossing her legs and looking at me with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. "You've grown up so much." You know that she said. Her tone was light, but the words hung between us heavy with unspoken meaning. "You're not the little boy I used to know." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't like her. We had always had a friendly, almost casual relationship, but today something felt dangerous, I guess. I mumbled, not sure how to respond. She leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. "No, really," she insisted, "you've changed, and I think we both know it." The way she said it made me. There was strange tension building in the room, and I didn't know how to break it. "Olivia, what are you?" I tried to ask, finally forcing the question out. I needed to understand what was happening here, and why the air felt so thick with something unspoken. For a moment she didn't respond. Instead, she just looked at me, her eyes searching mine as though she was trying to find the right words. Then she sighed and stood up, walking over to the window. "Dad's gone for the weekend," she said quietly, staring out into the yard. "It's just the two of us here." I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going, but feeling that knot in my stomach tighten. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You know, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft. "There are things I've wanted to talk to you about things that I've never had the courage to say until now." I swallowed hard, like when she took a step closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "Like us," she said it simply. The word hung in the air, and I felt my pulse rise. What was she implying? This didn't make sense. I tried to laugh, but my voice shook. "To what do you refer?" Olivia smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my stomach flip. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. "The way things have changed between us. We're not just stepmother and stepson anymore." My mind was spinning, trying to catch up with her words, trying to understand what was happening. But there was a part of me deep down she knew exactly what she was talking about and how I had felt it. Two things had shifted over the last few months, the subtle glances, the lingering touches. But I had always pushed those feelings aside. I convinced myself they weren't real. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my voice barely whispered. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, and suddenly the room felt much too small. "Yes, you do," she said softly, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. "You felt it too." I stood up abruptly, stepping away from her. I was trying to clear my head. "Olivia, this is crazy," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my stepmom. We shouldn't." But she didn't back down. She followed me, closing the distance between us again. "Why not?" Her eyes glowed with intensity as she whispered, causing my heart to race. "Both adults. We don't have to follow anyone else's rules." I shook my head, trying to resist the pull that was drawing me closer to her. "No, this isn't right," I insisted, but even as I spoke, I could feel my resolve waning. "What if it's really her?" She counted, her hand reaching out to touch my cheek. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I was frozen, trapped in the web she was weaving around us. I wanted to say no, to push her away, to run out of the room and forget this ever happened. But I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, and I hated myself for it. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The tension in the house had grown unbearable. Every time I saw Olivia, I could feel the weight of what we weren't saying pressing down on me, suffocating me, but I didn't know how to confront it. I didn't know how to set the days that blurred together. Every interaction between us felt loaded, like we were walking on a razor's edge. I tried to keep my distance, avoiding being alone with her as much as possible, but it wasn't easy. She always seemed to find a way to be close to me, to make her presence known, whether it was a casual touch on the arm or the way she looked at me from across the room. There was always this simmering tension that refused to go away. Then came the night everything changed. Dad was working late, and I was trying to stay holed up in my room, hoping that if I avoided her long enough, things would go back to normal, but deep down I knew that wasn't going to happen. I could hear her moving around downstairs, the sound of the TV playing softly in the background. The clock ticked loudly on my wall. I considered calling a friend and inventing an excuse to leave the house, but something prevented me from picking up the phone. Instead, I found myself standing outside my room, listening to the silence that had settled over the house. It was too quiet, too still, and that's when I made a decision that would change everything. I walked downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Olivia was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand, her gaze distant as she stared at the TV. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she did but pretended not to. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, unsure of what to say or even what I was doing. But then she looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and I knew there was no turning back. "She couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too casual. There was something in the way she said it that made my pulse quicken, the same way it had that first day. "Yeah," I mumbled, not trusting myself to say anything more. I walked over to the couch and sat down, leaving as much space between us as possible, but even with that distance, I could feel the tension between us, thick and unspoken. We sat inside silence for a few moments, the only sound being the quiet hum of the TV. I could feel her watching me, her eyes lingering on me in a way that made my skin tingle. I didn't know what to do. I was unsure of how to break the silence without escalating the situation, but before I could utter a word, she spoke again. "I've been thinking about us," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "Olivia, we're just getting started," but she interrupted me before I could finish. She asked, turning around, "Why are we engaging in pretense instead of confronting the situation directly? There's nothing between us when we both know there is." Her words struck me with the force of a blow to the abdomen. I wished to contest her assertions, to assert that she was mistaken, and that we should not pursue this course, yet the reality is that I lack the fortitude to engage in conflict. Not anymore. I too experienced the peculiar attraction between us that has intensified with time. I attempted to dismiss it, persuading myself of its unreality. But now, in his presence, I could no longer refute. "I cannot accomplish this," I stated, although my tone lacked assurance. Despite articulating the phrase, I recognized them as falsehoods. I was deceiving her and myself. She inclined closer, her hand positioned on the cushion separating us. "We are not engaging in any wrongdoing," she murmured, her tone subdued and fervent. "We are not causing harm to anyone." I shook my head, attempting to dispel the confusion clouding my thoughts. Yet I weakly contended that it was incorrect. She extended her hand. She placed her palm on mine, her contact transmitting a surge of excitement through my body. "Who determines what is right and what?" she inquired with a tone that was unwavering, her gaze fixed upon mine. I swallowed hard, my heart beating in my chest. I wanted to withdraw and instruct her to stop, but I was unable to do so. The intensity, as well as the feelings that I had been trying to suppress for a long time, ensnared me. "We are not required to adhere to the regulations that others have set," she said, her fingers slowly caressing and tracing designs on the back of my palm. "We are able to judge for ourselves what is appropriate." I tried to block out her voice and the sensation of her touch by closing my eyes, but it was futile. My barriers were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it before I could respond or find the strength to leave. She came in closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she added, "Tell me you don't." Her words caused a chill to go down my spine, and I detested the extent to which my body reacted to her, as well as the depth of my desire to comply with her. The moment stretched on, the tension between us growing thicker with each passing second, and then, without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and kissed her. The kiss began gently and timidly, as if I were trying to take a deep breath. I began to voice my objections to her, telling her that this was wrong and that we couldn't do it, but I found myself turning to face her instead. My breath caught in my throat as our eyes locked. While we were evaluating the scenario, we were uncertain about what would occur. However, the situation rapidly became more intense, which fueled our enthusiasm. I reached out and gripped her waist, bringing her closer to me as we finally gave in to the long simmering longing that had been building up. As her fingers entwined with my hair, the world dissolved, allowing us to fully immerse ourselves in the intensity of the moment. Even though I knew the infraction and that we were crossing an impenetrable barrier, I did it. I didn't want to interrupt the kiss as it became more intense, and my mind was full of thoughts that were in conflict with each other. There was a risk that I was aware of. Even though I was aware that we were taking a risk, I did not show any concern. This was something that I had wanted for a longer amount of time than I was willing to admit, and there was a part of me that had been wanting it. Both of us were apathetic when it came time for us to part ways completely. As she took a deep breath, she muttered, her breath warming across my skin as she relaxed her body. Her eyes were dark and filled with an intensity that I was unable to completely explain. Our faces were only a few inches apart from one another. I had come to the realization that our relationship was about to undergo an irreversible transition. This had been something for which I had longed for a prolonged period of time. I am also aware that you have done the same thing. I refrained from providing a response. It was impossible for me to do so because the reality was too much for me to bear. I did little more than nod, my pulse beating as the seriousness of our previous acts engulfed me. However, I was aware that this was merely the beginning, as the kiss was only the beginning of what was to follow. The following night would bring eternal abundance. The circumstances would be different. I could no longer look at Olivia in the same way. Whenever our eyes met, I felt a surge of warmth, a recall of the things we had done in the past, and the implicit assurance that we might run into each other again in the future. A dangerous tension and an understanding, which we both sensed but refrained from explicitly confronting each other about, seemed to infuse the atmosphere in the house. It was a tense and unsettling silence that lasted for several days. Despite the fact that it was impossible to completely ignore her, I did my best to keep my distance from her. Every single touch of her hand and every fleeting stare seemed like a spark that was poised to ignite the tension that was just below the surface. Despite my best efforts to resist, the attraction that existed between us was such that it was impossible for me to ignore the fact that the scenario was unsuitable. During the afternoon of one particular day, when Father was away once more, the domestic hush that prevailed grew insufferable. My thoughts kept going back to her, the recollection of that kiss, the sensation of her lips against mine, and the way my heart had raced, and it was just too much for me to bear. Although I detested myself for considering it, I was unable to stop myself from thinking about it at the same moment that I was beginning to fear that I would lose my sanity. In an effort to divert my attention away from the television, I was walking around the living room very quickly. When I looked back, I noticed that her footsteps were following closely behind me. Taking a cursory look, I was able to witness, despite the fact that everything remained unsaid, the tension that existed between us was thick and oppressive. However, she finally expressed herself in a subdued and cautious tone. Standing in the doorway, Olivia's look was temporarily inexplicable to those around her. Both of us remained silent. I agreed, and despite the fact that I had not adequately prepared myself, I admitted that my throat was tightening. That was the action that we participated in. She went over to the couch and sat down with a sigh after her. I sat across from her, keeping a strategic gap between us. My heart was racing, and I fought to meet her eyes during our conversation. I struggled with how to start the conversation and what to say to improve things. It is possible that it might have been different if I had information. I do not wish for you to feel uneasy. That is the very last thing I desire, she stated with her hands clenched in her lap. It bothers me that you are uncomfortable. I let out a loud groan, and the sensation on my lips was that they were parched. In spite of the fact that my voice is hardly audible above a whisper, I have acknowledged that I am unsure of how I feel about the situation. It is not typical for us to feel this way, and we should not be feeling it. Even though everything seemed fine, I didn't want it to stop. My uncertainty about our plan was real. I was unable to define or rationalize it, despite the fact that the feelings were unambiguous and, to a certain extent, there. With a serious expression on her face, Olivia looked down at her hands. It is not a problem that we can just ignore, despite the fact that I am aware that she made a statement that was not very harsh. The weight of our silence, which we did not speak, fully overpowered the silence that existed between us. We did not speak. It was as if I could feel the tension rising once more, and it brought to mind the dangerous attraction that had initially led us down this path. I uttered before I had the chance to control my emotions. Likewise, I gave it some thought. Upon uttering the words, I found myself unable to retract them, as they had become irrevocably committed to memory. Olivia's eyes met mine, and I suddenly realized we had crossed a threshold beyond reversibility, poised on the brink of something even more terrifying. At first, she did not speak, but the look in her eyes told everything that I needed to know in order to adequately appreciate the situation. I was filled with both terror and an evident sense of exhilaration as a result of the intensity and yearning that was a reflection of everything that I was experiencing. We cannot proceed in this manner. As I talked, my voice was shaking, and I was unsure of whether or not I was truly convinced of what I was saying. Olivia's gaze remained fixed on me. She said, "But we're already here, aren't we?" I recall her saying that. It was a place that was excessively crowded. Despite my inability to control my own desires, which were not hers and were ensnaring me, I felt compelled to flee, aiming to create as much distance as possible between us. Despite the fact that I did not have a complete understanding of the situation, the connection that existed between us was so strong that it was just hard to resist. Bringing her face to within a few inches of mine, she leaned forward. The sensation of her warm, gentle breath on my skin caused my heart to beat in my chest. I felt it touch my flesh. For a brief moment, I believed I could stop it, pull away, and end this before it escalated. But when her lips touched mine, all rational thought vanished. It expressed our repressed stress and accumulated yearning, and it was unique to this situation. It was neither insecure nor hesitant in any way. While my hands gripped the couch's fabric to maintain my composure, I instinctively kissed her back. There was no love or affection involved. Rather, it was a necessity and an intense yearning that we were unable to control. In addition to my heart beating very quickly, my mind was filled with a plethora of concepts that I was unable to fathom. It was at that moment that I became aware that this circumstance was hopeless. When we finally parted ways, our foreheads pressed together, the weight of our recent deeds pressing hard on us, leaving us unable to catch our breath. I repeated what I had stated earlier, despite the fact that my voice was weak and without conviction and that none of us attempted to disturb the moment that we were required to shut down. Olivia was the recipient of my hushed words. "It's so difficult, isn't it?" Due to the fact that there was nothing else to say, I chose not to answer. In spite of the fact that we used a tremendous deal of effort to extract ourselves from the web that we had built, the pull that existed between us continued to bring us back together. It was at that moment that the event took place. She leaned toward me once more, and we were unable to resist the entire occurrence. The event took place in a brief amount of time, and it came to a conclusion just as soon as it had started. In spite of the fact that I felt it was a little bit too exciting, she did not show any care for my feelings. Following the completion of our activities, she gave me a grin, indicating that she had a tremendous deal of pleasure in participating in them. Following that, the coming few days seemed to pass in a haze, and we made an effort to act normally and pretend that nothing had occurred. The tension that existed between us, on the other hand, was indisputable, and I experienced the same feelings each time I saw her. We were circling each other, waiting to give in, and I knew it was only a matter of time. The surge of heat and the same deadly pull brought about this sensation. When my father was out late for work one evening, I found myself in the kitchen attempting to divert my attention by preparing dinner. However, the home's silence was so overwhelming that I couldn't focus on every sound that seemed to reverberate, which highlighted the importance of our task. At first, I was totally unaware that she had entered the room, but, as I turned around, there she was, resting against the door frame and looking at me with that same face that was impossible to read. "Do you require any assistance?" Despite her nonchalance, her question caused my y-axis to speed up dramatically. "Accelerate?" I responded, "No, I'm fine," despite the fact that my hands were shaking. I was standing too close to her overwhelming presence when she approached and walked over to me. Could you be sure? As I attempted to regain my composure, I took a deep breath. Olivia, we can't. I started, but she cut me off. We don't have to do anything, she said softly, her eyes locked on mine. But I think we both know where this is going. The words hung between us, heavy, and finally I wanted to argue and wanted to tell her she was wrong. But I couldn't because deep down I knew she was right. We stood there in silence in the space between us, shrinking with every passing second. And then, before I knew it, she was kissing me again. It was quick, almost fleeting, but it was enough to reignite everything we had been trying to hold back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and fleeting glances. It was like living in two separate worlds. One where everything seemed normal and another where CLA and I were constantly on the verge of something we couldn't control. The weight of our secret was heavy, but we couldn't stay away from each other. No matter how much I told myself it needed to stop, that we needed to stop it from happening, every time Dad left for work or stayed out late, the tension between us grew. I'd find myself in the same room as her, and without saying a word, we'd both know what was coming next. It was terrifying how easily we had slipped into this. Every touch, every look felt like we were crossing some invisible line, yet it was never enough to make either of us pull back. Instead, we were drawn closer together as if something bigger than both of us was guiding us down this path. I could feel the shift the moment I woke up that morning, the quiet anticipation that had become all too familiar as the hours ticked by. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that we wouldn't be able to come back from. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the air in the house felt especially thick. There was a company event that Dad was attending, and he wouldn't be back until late. Olivia was washing dishes in the kitchen with her back to me. I was unable to see her. Even though I was standing by the door and watching her without knowing what to say or do, she did not flinch, which indicates that she must have been aware that I was present. She asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching mine, "Are you okay?" I wasn't sure. It had been a while since I hadn't, but how could I acknowledge that? How could I explain the raging storm inside me, the battle between right and wrong? I don't know. I finally replied with my voice barely audible. Olivia approached me and stopped just a few feet away. I had been thinking that she started her words slowly and deliberately and that perhaps we ought to talk about what has been going on. I tensed up, not sure if I wanted to have this conversation. What was there to say that hadn't already been said with our actions? She wasn't backing down, and I knew that I couldn't avoid it forever. What is there to talk about? I asked her with my heart racing. She was rubbing her forehead with the back of her hand. I don't know. Maybe we need to figure it out. We can't continue living this way, pretending it's not happening. She was correct, but the information didn't appeal to me. Where do you think it's going? I questioned whether my voice was harder than I intended. I ran my hand through my hair as fury began to well up inside of me. Olivia cringed slightly but did not break eye contact. She said, "I don't know, but I do know that we can't continue to skirt the subject." I ran my hand through my hair. "What do you want from me?" I erupted, not because I was enraged with her, but because I was also unable to provide the answers. "Do you agree?" She wants me to say I'm fine with this, but I'm not. I'm not fine with any of this. Her expression softened as she stepped closer, reducing the distance between us. "I don't want you to be fine with it," she said quietly. "I just want you to be honest with yourself and with me." Her words struck me deeply, as I understood her meaning perfectly. For so long, I told myself this was just a phase that would end if we ignored it, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't stop craving her, and the more I tried to resist it, the stronger it grew. I didn't know how to do that. I admitted my voice was breaking. I didn't know how to be honest about this. Olivia softly placed her hand on my arm, and the overwhelming desire I had for it caused a shiver to run down my spine. I was unable to contain my excitement. "It's okay," she whispered, her eyes filled with understanding. "We'll figure it out together." The sincerity in her voice broke something inside me, and before I knew it, I was pulling her closer, kissing her like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. This time the kiss wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow and deliberate, like we'll figure it out together. The sincerity in her voice broke something inside me, and before I knew it, I was pulling her closer, kissing her like it was the sincerity in her voice broke something inside me, and before I knew it, I was pulling her closer, kissing her like it was the only thing keeping me grounded this time. The kiss wasn't rushed or it was slow and deliberate, like we were both trying to hold on to something that was slipping through our fingers when we finally pulled apart, her forehead resting against mine. And we stood there in silence, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel her heartbeat fast and erratic, matching my own. Are we doing this? I whispered, more to myself than to her. Knowing it couldn't last, I knew that something had to give eventually, but I wasn't ready to face that. Yet one evening everything came to a sudden halt with Olivia upstairs, and Dad expected to be out late again. I sat in the living room, the TV muted and my thoughts distant, but I wasn't paying attention to the time. I was too wrapped up in my own head, thinking about everything we had done and everything we couldn't undo. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my thoughts, and for a moment I froze. I had not anticipated my father's early return, and I rushed to stand up. However, before I could respond, he was already striding into the living room, his eyes searching the area before landing on me. Panic flooded my chest. I had not anticipated his early return. I was trying to keep the panic from showing up, and I could feel my pulse racing and the guilt piercing through me like a poison. He spoke casually, but there was a tinge of something I couldn't quite place. "What are you doing?" I responded in my own voice. I was just watching television. Because he didn't appear to notice, or perhaps he did and was choosing to ignore it, he sat down on the couch and flipped through the channels as if it were just another ordinary night. I attempted to calm myself down and convince myself that everything was fine, but the weight of what we were hiding was pressing down on me and suffocating me instead. A few minutes later, Olivia came down the stairs with a countenance that was meticulously neutral. She greeted her father as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was completely normal. However, I could see the stress in her eyes and the way that her hands were fidgeting at her sides. Dinner that night was excruciating. The conversation was stilted, and every time Dad spoke, I could feel the walls closing around me, making it impossible for me to meet Olivia's gaze. I couldn't concentrate on anything other than the tightening knot of fear in my chest. "You've been spending a lot of time with Olivia lately," he said, his voice calm but probing. My heart stopped. I glanced at Olivia, who had gone pale. Her eyes widened in terror. I guess I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad's gaze lingered on me for a long moment, and I could feel the air in the room shift. "Is there anything you would like to share with me?" he inquired in a tone casual yet perceptive. There was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. I opened my lips to speak, but nothing came out as my thoughts raced. I was looking for something, anything, that would make this all go away, but I couldn't find the words. As the truth loomed before us, threatening to reveal itself, I found it impossible to conceal. I was unable to lie. I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. "Nothing." Dad didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at me with those unreadable eyes, and in that silence, I knew he knew too. Standing there, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, I realized there was no escaping what had already begun. Even if the words remained unspoken, the truth remained waiting, and it would follow me no matter how hard I tried to outrun it. Olivia's hand brushed mine under the table with a silent plea, but it only made the guilt worse. I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible.